Hi, I'm Alex Holste. Today's date is April 25th, 2018, and the password is purple. Here's my audience. Will, Kaylee, and Paige. Okay. The United States has the largest number of prison inmates in the world, even though there are two countries with populations twice the size. Almost 50% of the inmates we have in those prisons are there right now due to drug offenses. This all started in 1971 when former President Nixon declared war on drugs. There are a lot of issues with the war on drugs. First of all, who started it? Former President Nixon is not a man that any of us should look up to. He resigned from the presidency to avoid impeachment by Congress, and more recently, an aide has admitted that the war on drugs was nothing more than a political tool used by the Nixon administration to hurt his political opponents. And unfortunately, it worked, and it's still working. According to an article by the Washington Post in 2013 titled "The Black-White Marijuana Arrest Gap in 9 Charts," it clearly lays out that African Americans and Caucasians use drugs, specifically marijuana, at similar rates. However, African Americans suffer arrest rates at 3 times the rate compared to their white counterpart. And that's not the only inequality created from the war on drugs. The war on drugs also created an economic inequality. When we created the war on drugs, it affected people of all economic statuses. However, it hurt the poor and the lower class a lot more because those people were crushed financially by their court fees, and they got stuck with the overworked public defenders that often just tell their client to take their plea deal, whether they want to maintain their innocence or not. It's also messed up our court system because it's really clogging up the court system. Like I said, almost 50% of the people in prison are there because of the war on drugs. And you can tell because it can take months to see a judge now. So the war on drugs is also affecting everyone's right to a fair and speedy trial. It's also led to some horrible foreign policy decisions. When we created the war on drugs, we obviously also created a black market for those drugs. And unfortunately, that black market capital seems to have taken place in poor Latin American countries. When former President Reagan took office, he decided to try to use military intervention to stop the flow of drugs from Latin American countries, and it has not worked whatsoever. According to an article from The Guardian in 2014 titled "The United States War on Drugs and Its Legacy in Latin America," our militaries have been completely ineffective in reducing the drugs flowing out of Latin America. The only thing we've been capable of doing is to move the cartels around the continent, and that has come with a lot of casualties. According to the article, thousands of people have died in Latin America because of the war on drugs. Clearly, this policy isn't working, and the United States needs to consider a different policy. I think the exact opposite of policy. Instead of criminalizing drugs, we should decriminalize drugs, and we wouldn't be the first country to do so. In fact, according to The Guardian, in a 2017 article titled "Portugal's Radical Drugs Policy is Working. Why Hasn't the World Copied It?" This article clearly shows that after Portugal implemented the decriminalization of drugs, they saw lower crime rates, lower drug use, and fewer infections, something that the United States could really benefit from considering the CDC says that our STD rates are currently on the rise. Now, this would, of course, come with some costs from the government. We would have to fund rehabilitation programs and needle exchange programs to reduce the infectivity rate. But in the end, we would actually save a lot of money because we wouldn't have to pay for all of these prosecutions, arrests, and later the detainment for all of these people. And it would drastically reduce our prison population. In fact, according to an article published by the Huffington Post in 2017, almost 50% of the people in our prisons in 2011 were there because of drug offenses. We could also save money abroad as well if we considered legalization. We spend a lot of money right now abroad trying to keep drugs out of our country, when it might even be more effective to just let the drugs be. According to an article published by Forbes in 2018 titled "Violent Crime has Dropped in Border States with Legal Cannabis," we find out that states that have legalized marijuana have actually seen a reduction in their crime rate. And it's really not that surprising if we think about the previous prohibition in America from the 1920s. When we created that prohibition on alcohol, we saw gangs and mafias pop up everywhere. Al Capone coming to mind right away. And of course, the second the prohibition was ended, all of those gangs and mafias were gone. The same thing could happen here. It would reduce the violence rate, not just in our country, but also the country that the drugs are coming in from, because then we would also reduce the amount of people involved in the cartel and the amount of people that country needs to fight against, and it would just reduce the amount of money that they could make. And it would redirect that money to America and to the American government, because right now we don't make any tax money on the illegal drugs that are sold in America. And either way, those drugs are going to be sold in America. Just by legalizing those drugs, we would get billions of dollars in taxes. Just looking at any state that's considered legalization and implemented it, we see that they get billions of dollars that they can flood into education, infrastructure, and other programs that desperately need funding. So we should really consider electing officials and supporting policies that wouldn't just decriminalize drugs, but also legalize some drugs. We should consider that because it would lead to fewer drug overdoses, fewer violence, crimes, and fewer infections. It would also reduce the crime rate in other countries that would desperately need our help. The point is, we could save a lot of countless lives here, so I'm asking you to please donate at drugpolicy.org, and even more importantly, make sure to vote